Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to be here in a topic which is depressingly relevant. I mean, it's quite striking that when we saw those developments in Spain and Portugal with the sudden sort of cut in energy supply, everyone would say, oh, is it a cyber attack? Now, apparently it's not a cyber attack, though a cynic might suggest that even if it was, the Spanish government might be hesitant about admitting it anyway. But down that way, all sorts of conspiracy theories lie. So what I'm going to be talking about in the next kind of three units, firstly, I will be talking about the specifically Russian thinking about, I really hate the term hybrid war, incidentally. I think it's inaccurate and unhelpful, but it's the term of art that we're stuck with. Except that I note the Americans are already saying, no, don't use hybrid war, it's grey zone warfare. The new buzzword, equally meaningless, but nonetheless, so we go. Where would modern warfare be without buzzwords and acronyms? And PowerPoint. Anyway, so I'll be talking firstly about the specifically Russian way of thinking about this, because I think it's really important because they have a very different perspective. And in many ways, I would suggest a much more advanced perspective about actually how the non-shooting side of conflict can evolve and how it also connects into the shooting side of things. There will be a break and a time for questions and answers. Well, questions, maybe answers. Then we'll be holding a scenario exercise in which actually sort of playing out in a sort of fictitious situation what different elements of the Russian power system might consider to be appropriate tactics. Because again, I think that's a crucial thing to realize. When we're talking about the Russians, we're not talking about a single monolithic group that is always marching in lockstep. We're often talking about the interaction between different individuals, different institutions. So that's also something to try and understand when you're trying to work out how the Russians operate. And then in the afternoon, I will kind of broaden the aperture to more or less look at, well, what does the experience of Russian hostile non-kinetic activity tell us more generally about the nature of threats, challenges, and indeed opportunities in the modern world. So that's sort of a fair amount of ground to cover. But we'll start with talking about specifically the Russians. So I'm going to talk briefly, trying not to get too stuck in my role as a historian, about the evolution of Russia's kind of concept, its strategic culture, how this particularly had led to shifts in the notion of Russian warfighting, which is, as I say, it is important to stress, different from our own in the West, how this specifically operationalizes in Putin's Russia, which on one level obviously builds on all these historical traditions and the sort of cultural assumptions encoded within them, but also brings its own very specific concerns and issues, and then looking at the sort of broader whole challenge to the West type thing. So let's just start. I'm going to talk very briefly about what strategic culture is. You probably all know. My apologies probably for telling you stuff you already know. Strategic culture is, in some ways, it's the natural strategic instincts of a particular country, of a particular culture. It is rooted in issues of sort of enduring circumstances, i.e., where are you in the world? In Russia's case, you're at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. You're a relatively impoverished but large country with long, hard-to-defend borders, whose experience has been that because of your location, at some point in history, any rising military power in Asia or in Europe will at some point want to have a go at you. Whether we're talking about the Mongols, whether we're talking about the Teutonic Knights or Napoleon or Hitler, there is that sense of constantly being under threat. And that's because of location, it's because of economics. So it's not about the decisions and the policy. It's about what are the kind of basic assumptions that the people making those decisions have. And I would suggest that Russia has left it with a tendency to think of itself always as being under threat, that threats are always existential, and also, and there's a danger here because we don't orientalize too much, but nonetheless, that the best defense is a good, solid, preemptive offense. That sure, Russia is a big country. Russia can trade space for time, and has, whether it's against Napoleon or whether it's against Hitler. But you don't want to do that. Far better is actually, if you think, well, Putin himself, in his memoirs, when he's talking about the lessons he learned running with street gangs in the still half-ruined city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, said that one of the lessons he learned was, if you're going to get into a fight, throw the first punch. And in many ways, he was actually channeling one of the core themes, I would say, of Russian strategic culture. So it's the basic assumptions of what is a threat, how serious threats are, and how you basically are inclined to deal with it. And the same way as one could say, take Britain, an island state that hasn't actually been conquered or indeed invaded since 1066, will have a different set of basic encoded attitudes about how you deal with other countries than somewhere like Russia. So this fits within this concept of strategic culture. And just to go through these in a bit more detail, the enduring circumstances, I mentioned size and borders and Eurasian location. Also, the fact that this is a country with a marginal agrarian base. Now, you probably didn't come into a lecture on modern hybrid warfare and expect to be told about medieval agriculture, but never mind. Russia could not go through the same agrarian revolution that Europe went through that in effect fueled the Industrial Revolution. When you found new techniques and new technologies that mean you can farm more efficiently, that allows you to let your cities grow because there's more food around to basically feed non-farming mouths. It also means more trade. More trade means more cash available for investment in the emerging industries. I have taken the whole body of economic literature and squeezed it down ruthlessly into about 4 sentences, but that's a basic fact. Because of soil, because of climate, and for a variety of other reasons, Russia was never able to go through that agrarian revolution. Beginning of the 19th century, its agricultural productivity was about the same as it was in the medieval period. So you've not got this natural boost to your national income, which allows you to spend money on other things. And yet, this is a country which is going to be facing, periodically, the rising military powers of the age. I mean, this is something that particularly sort of came to light for the Russians in the 1850s, in the Crimean War, the other Crimean War, where they found themselves facing the preeminent military powers of the age, the French and the British. The British and the French. In which they were facing a vastly more technologically advanced military structure. Because the French and the British were using steamships and railways, and most Russian troops had to just simply walk on foot, it was actually quicker to reinforce armies in the Crimea, which was then, of course not now, south of Russia, with reinforcements from London than from Moscow. Much Russian artillery was outranged by British rifles. This is a war in which technology really clearly made the edge. And this is a problem that Russia has faced. If you're poor but vulnerable, you have to find other ways of raising the money to arm your troops, buy in foreign specialists, and generally meet that military threat. And in some ways, that is the answer to Russian authoritarianism. It's not because Russians have barbed wire in their DNA or anything like that. It's not because Russians are naturally servile and are happy when they have an authoritarian leader. Put aside all of these kind of cultural why Russians are different bad people. No, it's quite simply that an authoritarian regime is needed to squeeze more resources out of the peasantry. You tax that much more viciously and heavily, and because you're a huge country, when the peasants resist, you have to deal with them especially brutally to deter any other resistance. Again, now I have just simply summarized all of Russian history in about 4 sentences. All of these are clearly simplifications, but they are essential ones. Because this has always been Russia's problem, that sense that it is vulnerable because of its backwardness. And good old Uncle Joe Stalin particularly sort of raised this. I won't read all of this. I mean, presumably it's okay for the slides. Yeah, the slides it have been or will be distributed, so you can read it. But this point that he makes about one feature of the history of old Russia was the continual beating she suffered because of her backwardness. Goes from Mongol Khans all the way to Japanese barons, because various forms of backwardness. And this has been a classic problem, and it's an enduring problem today. The Russians are able, in some narrow specialist areas, to match, sometimes even overmatch, Western technology. But the point is, that tends to be, firstly, a short-term advantage, and secondly, it's a very narrow one. And in fact, they're increasingly concerned about the way that China is rising so fast. For so long, they themselves had this complacent, racist attitude that the Chinese had numbers, but not technology, which is in many ways the attitude we've always had about the Russians. That's another matter. But now suddenly they're finding that the Chinese are not just simply copying technology, they're actually innovating and spending a lot of money on it. So, you're a backward country, but nonetheless, a country which actually has to deal with these sort of modern threats all the time, whether modern means full plate armor or it means precision-guided munitions. And the response, I would suggest, within the sort of the Russian strategic culture is to adopt these 3 A's: authoritarian centralism, aggressive defensiveness, and asymmetric assumptions. So, authoritarian centralism. As I said, you need to have an authoritarian regime in order to maximize your tax base. You need to have the deterrence of fear, because you can't be constantly rushing your security forces all around the country, especially in days before planes and trains. And therefore, people have to know that if they rise, maybe not tomorrow, but next week or next month, a regiment of troops will arrive and your ringleaders will all be being hung at the crossroads. There's this constant cycle of threat perceptions as a result of that kind of model. Russia's leaders see a threat from outside their borders. They know they need to modernize. Now, how do you modernize? Well, obviously you modernize by extorting more money from the peasants, or from the economy generally, but also probably by some kind of liberalization. Because you need to bring in more technologies, you'll probably need to bring in foreign experts and listen to them and so forth. So we have a sort of the process of a beginning of what we might think of as reform, but very much aimed at military technology. And time again, I mean, if you think of Peter the Great wanted a navy because he loved ships, but also because he saw that that would be absolutely necessary for Russia's sort of next stage of its development as a great power. How do you get a navy? It's not just a question of money, though you do need money. You also need all these foreign experts and technologies. Yes, you can hire experts, but you're also going to need your own. You're going to need, for example, engineers and mathematicians. Mathematics being crucial for artillery. Well, mathematicians, where are you going to find mathematicians? You start to build up the basis of what are going to be universities. So military reform will inevitably require wider political and social reform, which tends to then spiral out of control. All of a sudden, you find new classes arising, more protests. The peasants whom you're oppressing so hard for the tax revenue are fighting back. Again, people have this notion that Russia's history is one of acceptance of authoritarianism. Actually, Russia's history is one of constant resistance, of constant risings. The problem has always been that it's very rarely connected. It's a protest in a city here, it's a rising in a village there, all of which can be piecemeal defeated. But actually the Russians have constantly been resisting. And at a certain point, the pendulum of threat perception swings back the other way. That they begin to think, no, actually the big threat is domestic, not external. We need to crack down. We need to go back to conservatism and social control. And for a while that works, but meanwhile Russia gets more and more backward until something happens to remind it of the risks that poses. And again, let me use the Crimean War as an example. After the defeat of Napoleon, although Napoleon was defeated in Russia as much as anything else by that point, overstretch, limited supply lines, the fact that his empire was in many ways a pyramid scheme that depended upon constant new conquests. But nonetheless, it was enough to allow Tsar Nicholas I, who realized that Russia in many ways really needed reform, but was scared of the implications thereof, to think, actually, we're not as badly off as we thought. We were able to defeat Napoleon. That says something. We're not vulnerable. We don't have to reform. And so you have a period of conservatism that then ends with this sort of shocking defeat in the Crimean War, which was also not just a defeat on the Crimean Peninsula. In many ways, the Crimean War was actually defeated in the Northern and Baltic Seas by the Royal Navy. The French might have helped a bit. By the Royal Navy blockading Russian trade, and again, using its vastly superior naval technology to ensure that it could lock down Russian trade. So, a new Tsar, who fortuitously comes to power at this time, Alexander II, decides that actually, no, it's clear that our backwardness is a crucial security vulnerability. We need to reform, we need to modernize. He frees the serfs, leads to huge amounts of rural unrest. Alexander II gets killed by terrorists, and the pendulum swings back once again. It's no, we've got to clamp down. So there's this constant swing between, is the threat outside our borders, or is it inside our borders? And this may seem fairly irrelevant to actually how the Russians then deal with foreign enemies. But for reasons I'll come to, it's actually quite central. And finally, sort of another last fundamental is the supremacy of the political. The generals are always kept in their place because the political leadership is always scared of the generals. Whether we're talking about Marshal Zhukov after World War II, whether we're talking about, again, the great old figures of the Russian military pantheon, Suvorov and so forth, they're always kept under tight political control, precisely because the generals are so desperately needed by the political leadership. So that's authoritarian centralism. Aggressive defensiveness. As I mentioned, it's about not just using your strategic depth, but ideally not having to do so, using someone else's strategic depth instead. Striking first, particularly because of your weakness. So much of Russian military policy is built around this notion of weakness. So how can you adapt for that? Well, one of the ways is precisely by making sure the war is fought on your terms. By striking first, you get to define the operational parameters of the conflict, or at least that's the idea. It doesn't always work, just ask the Ukrainians. But nonetheless, that's part of this thinking. And yes, you throw the first punch. And then the most crucial element for the context of this lecture, asymmetric assumptions. You're always, or almost always, going to be fighting a more conventionally powerful enemy that's more advanced, that its economy is larger or more dynamic or whatever else. Well, what do you therefore do? Essentially, you become a geopolitical guerrilla. Now, guerrillas know that they are always going to be weaker, or almost always going to be weaker than the state they're fighting. So what do? You make sure you move the battle space to where you're strongest, or at the very least, that your enemy is weakest. Now, when I say move the battle space, sometimes that means literally picking the right battlefield. But actually, from the Russians' point of view, it's also fight the kind of conflict at which you feel you are best suited and are most likely to win. So, if you are fighting, for example, modern, advanced, well-armed democracies, you don't take them on in the battlefield. You challenge them where you think they are particularly weak, which is precisely because they are democracies. Now, for the record, I think democracy is a great thing. But if you are Putin, and if you are the Russian leadership, the very fact that we have so many actual and potential divisions within and between our countries, this constellation of Western democracies, that is where they see the opportunities. That is where the battle space lies. So to appreciate this, you have to realize that from the Russians' point of view, conventional, tactical, kinetic warfighting, disinformation, political war, subversion, all of these things, they are just simply part of one continuum of military operations. And this is why I said that in many ways the Russians, I think, are more advanced at this than we are. We are still so heavily siloed. There are things that soldiers do. There are things that police officers do. Things that counterintelligence officers do. Things that political spin-right artists do. But these are all separate. And indeed, within our systems, they are meant to remain separate. We don't want soldiers doing the jobs of police officers if we can avoid it. We don't want police officers doing the job of politicians if we can avoid it. The Russians have a much, much more holistic perspective. And in particular, what it means is, as I say there, that they see war as often actually a battle of will and imagination. Not just simply about the algorithm of how many troops have you got and how accurate your weapon systems may be. In Tolstoy's massive War and Peace, there is an interesting observation that the French approach this war like a duelist, elegant, sophisticated, bearing a sword. Well, the Russians chose not to fight that way. Instead, they picked up the club of total war, of mobilizing their whole society regardless of the cost. And ultimately, the club beat the elegant sword. This is the point. It's about, well, what is the right weapon? How should we fight? Can we outthink the enemy so that we can ensure a different way of fighting that works for us? And above all, look, all wars are political acts. Only in video games are wars won by eliminating all the enemy's soldiers. In reality, it's about the enemy's will and capacity to continue to resist. That's where the Russians see the key point of focus, the Schwerpunkt, is on this issue of national will. And if they can destroy that without having to fight a single battle, great. If they need to fight battles, that's fine too. But the point is, it's not about how you fight, it's about winning. Which may sound like a really banal and obvious point, but it's one that I think in the West we often don't really think about. We don't think, this is the outcome, what are the best instruments to use? We tend to default to certain instruments based on how we perceive the threat. So how has this, and I'll do this very, very briefly, how has this evolved over time? If we start with the Tsarist era, I mentioned this, there's the sort of Tolstoy quote, so you can actually read it later and work out how I've misrepresented it. But again, the point is, in Tsarist times, the model that was created was precisely that the Russians had a tendency to be very wasteful in their use of forces. They often did regard their soldiers, I mean, let's be honest, until the sort of modern era, many nations were like this, but particularly the Russians, regarding their soldiers more or less as human ammunition. But this notion we have sometimes is that the Russians always relied on mass is inaccurate. Often, they could be just as capable as, in terms of their sort of tactical dispositions, just as determined as any other fighters. But the key point was, again, that this notion that they're always going to be somehow fighting a nation or an alliance which will in some ways be superior to them, whether it's in technology or whether it's in numbers, whether it's in economic strength. If we're talking about the Ottomans, one of the, again, we so often forget the sort of struggles to the south, but the Ottoman Empire at its peak was able to outmatch the Russians on pretty much any index of power: population, economy, military strength. Technology usually was often comparable. As I said, that was at the sort of the peak of the Ottoman era. And yet the Russians were able to fight wars, and sometimes successfully. How? By working out how they could best fight this particular enemy. Moving on from the Tsarist era, Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, born out of the chaos and misery of the First World War. Again, a war that everyone has miseries, but the Russians particularly. I mean, at peak, the Russians were losing 150,000 men a month in this war. No wonder in some ways that the Tsarist regime collapsed. But from the Bolsheviks' point of view, they come to power of a country that is absolutely ravaged, not just by World War I, but then by the subsequent civil war in which the Bolsheviks extend their rule from a handful of cities across the country. So they are massively impoverished. They have this notion that, well, it doesn't really matter because they're just the first. And any minute now, the more advanced industrial countries will also fall to revolution. Doesn't happen that way. So they suddenly find themselves sort of this outcast pariah nation, whom so many other nations actually have quite an incentive to destroy because they want to destroy the ideology that underpins this state. And they are regarded not just as outsiders, but also they are seriously underestimated. I remember reading an interesting British military intelligence report from, I think it was 1937, 37, 36, that kind of period, that was running through the military establishments of Central and Eastern Europe. And it said, the Red Army, I mean, it's big, it's probably all right, but it's not the Poles. The Poles were regarded as the military superpower of Central Europe at that time. Again, as we know, things didn't work out quite so well for the Poles soon enough. But the point is exactly, so everyone regards you as being both evil as well as too weak to really seriously make an alliance with, even as Nazi Germany is on the rise. You have this belief in world revolution that still hasn't sort of manifested itself. You also have the rise of Stalin. I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution was a strange and paradoxical one. It contained within it certain values and ideals which were wonderful about a world without coercion, where everyone would be sort of content and so forth. The other side of it, though, was an incredibly brutal doctrine that basically said, because the ends we're working for are so wonderful, whatever means we use are acceptable. Well, what we saw through the Civil War and then with the rise of Stalin was in some ways all those positive values got totally lost, and it's all about the means. So you have this brutal, centralized regime regarding itself as being opposed by essentially the whole world. It tries, in some ways, what we might think of as in modern terms, hybrid operations. For example, in Estonia, very quickly aborted attempt to use the local Communist Party to allow it to seize power there. Doesn't work at all well. In the Spanish Civil War, we see the Soviets sending contingents that, if nothing else, spend a lot of their time just trying to purge ideological enemies within the Republican side, rather than fighting the fascist-backed monarchist forces. But essentially, this is a period in which actually a certain sense of paranoia and of isolation becomes dominant. But up to World War II, there's just not a lot the Soviets can do about it other than continued subversion. There's some interesting parallels with the modern world. All they can really do is say, well, look, we know that the West hates us. We know that the West will take any opportunity to destroy us if they can. So what we have to do is paralyze the West. We have to exploit the internal weaknesses of the West to ensure they're not in a position to unite against us. Now, in particular, that meant through trade union movements and other leftist bodies. But it also, in some cases, involved espionage, obviously, but also blackmail, subversion, corruption, even of figures who might say were not at all naturally pro-Soviet, but just simply if you had some leverage on them, you could use them to continue this division of the West. You're not really trying to win friends. You're not thinking that you can use the trade union movement to take over countries, so much as using them to paralyze countries, which is precisely, I would suggest, the current Russian strategy towards the West, that essentially they're trying to divide and paralyze us. So there are some striking parallels between very different regimes. But anyway, World War II completely changes Soviet Union's position in the world. Comes out of World War II, one of the great powers, shown its military strength, suddenly acquired all sorts of extra territories, which are going to have to be controlled and pacified. Soon it will also be a nuclear power. So we have a rather different strategic context through the period of the Cold War. In the nuclear age, the thought that there could be some sort of direct big war between the Soviet Union and the West becomes near enough unthinkable. Not quite, but near enough unthinkable. So a lot of the tensions spread into, firstly, geographically other parts of the world. We have proxy wars, whether we're talking about Korea or Vietnam or the Angolan Civil War, or indeed later on Afghanistan, Soviet invasion of that. But also it moves much more directly into the non-military means. Again, a continued emphasis on subversion, on disinformation, on attempts to therefore paralyze the West. Without in any way trying to suggest that more than a fraction of them were sort of aware of this, but it is clear that, for example, the Soviets did everything they could to encourage the anti-nuclear movement. As I said, it's difficult sometimes talking about it because I don't want to suggest that CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was all just some kind of evil Soviet proxy. But the point is, if it was there, of course the Russians were going to try and encourage and make use of it, as they were going to try and find all sorts of other movements that they could find some leverage upon, encourage, in order to further their general mission. There's a new notion, therefore, of a kind of aggressive defense emerged, in not that there was any likelihood that we would see those Soviet tanks rolling through the Fulda Gap into West Germany, but instead we could see it being played out in the global south, in the anti-colonial struggles, and indeed in political warfare. So this idea that they had of a correlation of forces, this sort of constant trying to work out, well, what is the balance of power between us and the West, is not being defined in classic terms of how many tanks. It's also defined in terms of how much leverage, how much chaos are you able to deploy. 1990s is in some ways a kind of a blip, an interval, because the new Russia was in such chaos. It was unable really to define itself. Was it a new democratic nation? Was it a successor to the Soviet Union? Was it a successor to Tsarist Russia, or what? It's a period of drift, chaos, and anarchy. And all of the sort of those three A's were in crisis, in that basically Russia was unable either to really control itself, but also project its power abroad. But in some ways, precisely for that reason, it made it that much more likely that there would be a swing back to a figure like Putin. Not necessarily, it didn't have to be Putin himself. There were other potential Putins in the wings. He just happened to be the one that arose. And sort of central to his notion is this whole idea of sort of lifting Russia off his knees, as he put it, and asserting for itself this role as a great power that it feels we unfairly deny it. Again, without trying to justify it, I think it's important to try and understand. This is a genuinely held view from Putin and many Russians in general. This idea that Russia's standing as a great power is some ways its birthright. It's something that it has earned in blood. If you listen to Putin, he will essentially assert that Russia has time and again saved civilization. Historically, as a historian, it annoys me that Putin seems to consider himself to be a historian. He would be a D student at best. But anyway, I mean, he says, well, more or less that the Russians kind of absorbed the Mongols, and that's why the Mongols didn't continue to roll into Western Europe. Absolute nonsense, a whole variety of other reasons, but nonetheless, that's the official line. And likewise, it was the Russians who beat Napoleon. Marshal Blucher and Lord Wellington might have something to say about that. It was the Russians that beat Hitler. Bit more truth in that, but without Lend-Lease, without all the other forms of assistance, not quite so clear if that would have been the case. But it doesn't matter. This idea that basically Russia has saved civilization, and therefore civilization owes Russia. And so if we deny Russia that great power status, we are being unfair and hostile to Russia. And well, what does great power status mean? Again, Putin is a very 19th century geopolitician. His idea of a great power status includes the notion that a great power has a sphere of influence. Countries whose sovereignty is subordinated to the center. This is exactly what we're seeing playing out in Ukraine. There is that sense of Ukraine is not a real country, and what is there needs to realize that it is within Moscow's sphere of influence. Because if you have that mindset, you essentially see the world divided between a handful of great powers who give orders and the majority of countries where the only question is, whose orders do you take? And if Ukraine is not taking Moscow's orders, that means it's taking orders from Brussels, maybe more likely Washington. It's a very stark notion of the world that denies most countries agency. In that context, Putin is also of the view that he faces a hybrid war threat from the West. It's quite striking. I mean, what do the Russians call hybrid war? They call it гибридная война, which means hybrid war. In other words, they haven't even got their own name for it. As far as they're concerned, this is a Western invention. And the Arab Spring risings, the colored revolutions in post-Soviet space and so forth, they were not natural, organic risings against corrupt, authoritarian and unresponsive governments. No, they were all made in Langley. Though maybe with MI6 also involved. It has to be said, it still charms me that the Russians still have such a high regard for the British as their most subtle and devious enemy. I remember once having a meal with a moderately barking mad Russian think tanker, close to the Kremlin and so forth, who was going on about how the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine had been totally a CIA plot. And then he paused and said, but I bet the British had the idea in the first place. The Americans got the resources, but we are the sneaky ones. So that still makes me proud. But anyway, so there he is. From his point of view, Russia is denied its proper space in the world. It is facing constant assailments by a hostile conspiratorial West. In particular, a pivotal moment, 2011, 2012, major protests in Russia, the so-called Bolotnaya rising or protests. Again, he's not willing to believe that that was a genuine response of a rising middle class that was horrified by the sort of corruption of the electoral process and his return to the presidency. No, it was all Hillary Clinton and the State Department and the CIA. So in that context, well, again, it's this time when it's appropriate for Russia to basically strike out. And in particular, we see all of those three A's reaffirmed. Facing this Western threat, Russia has to be a single military-style structure. There can be no room for any kind of protest. And we've particularly obviously seen that since February 2022. But even before then, we were seeing the squeezing out of the last remnants of democracy and participation within Russia. So, authoritarian centralism, absolutely crucial. This sense that Russia needs to strike first. If the West gets its act together, God knows what it could do to Russia. So it's important for Russia now to make sure that the West is unable to do that. Remember, as far as Putin is concerned, what's happening in Ukraine is not really about Ukraine. It's actually a proxy war with the West. And the interesting thing is, call what's going on in Ukraine a war, and you risk being fined or sent to prison in Russia. However, Putin himself freely uses the word war when he's talking about Russia's relationship with the West. So as far as he's concerned, he is at war with us. But asymmetric assumptions. Of course, he's not going to deploy even when he had an army he could deploy, he's not going to deploy it against the most powerful military alliance in the world. What's the advantage? And think of what the risks are. Instead, he will move the battle space to where Russia can operate and does have a chance of disrupting its enemies. And that is this political conflict. So there we go, Putin's role. He wants to make Russia great again. He's this 19th century geopolitician, so his idea of greatness includes that it can break international law with impunity and that it has a sphere of influence. And he feels that the West is challenging Russia. In 1999, i.e. before he had been elected president for the first time, here are his words: Russia has been a great power for centuries and remains so. It has always had and still has legitimate zones of interest. We should not drop our guard in this respect. Neither should we allow our opinion to be ignored. He said that before he was president. This is not just something that has sort of come out new. This has been his attitude throughout. But nonetheless, he does realize that Russia is weak, that its economy, we often have the GDP comparison game. Oh, Russia's GDP, it's equivalent of Italy's or equivalent of Spain's or whatever. It's meaningless. It really doesn't say anything, not least because that's often based upon a direct comparison of rubles to euros, dollars, pounds, whatever. And the fact of the matter is that the Russian military is not using euros, dollars, pounds, or whatever to pay its soldiers and to buy its weapons and so forth. But it's ruble to ruble. But nonetheless, its economy is weaker. Its defense spending is more limited. I remember, again, this is back in 2021, giving a lecture to a collection of British Army cadets, one of whom sort of plaintively said, how can Russia maintain a 1 million-man army with this defense budget the same as Britain's? Well, the answer is it isn't the same as Britain's, except on those very artificial parity basis. But nonetheless, there is an awareness of the limits even of defense spending in Russia. That Russia has very little soft power. Soft power, this notion of countries wanting to be like you or wanting to be liked by you. Now, there are many authoritarian regimes that may well want to be like Putin's regime in terms of their control of the country and their capacity to suppress any opposition. But not many people are really saying, I wish my country was more like the Russian Federation. So you have to sort of cope with the fact that you don't have that. And technology. an awareness of the degree to which Russia does not have a technological edge, except, as I said, in very sort of limited terms. So, how is all of this operationalized today? We've moved from the history, sure, the great sigh of relief, to the current reality. Well, as I say, in terms of the authoritarian centralism, the need to try and create what's called the power vertical, to create it as the entire state is essentially one disciplined unit that responds to orders from above, has become not just a political but a strategic necessity. Let's be honest, it's often much more evident in form than reality, because this is also a country which is beset with all kinds of corruption, internecine, institutional conflicts and the like. But in theory, the idea is it's increasingly centralized and disciplined. More strikingly is the securitization of all aspects of society and the economy. And obviously we've particularly seen that since February 2022, where as the economy has essentially moved into a degree of sort of war footing. I say a degree of, because Putin is still, for political reasons, trying to maintain something of a balance between guns and butter. In other words, ensuring that for most Russians, they feel that actually life goes on okay. And I think this is one of the interesting things, because I think come 2026, it will be that much harder to maintain that. I think that's when he'll have to make some tougher decisions of guns or butter, and ordinary Russians will really begin to feel it. But nonetheless, whether we're talking about the school system, which is in many ways going back to a Soviet style of introducing within the curriculum, not just propaganda and public education, but also actually sort of training young men in the kind of skills that they will need as a conscript and that kind of thing, and militarized youth movements like the so-called youth army. But basically all aspects of society are increasingly being securitized. I was speaking to a friend who's an academic in Russia, who was saying that a book he planned to write, he couldn't find a publisher for until he reframed it. And this is just a piece of history. But I say just a piece of history, I mean, but until he reframed it as essentially how Russia was able to resist foreign influence. And suddenly he was able to get a publisher. Now, the fact of the matter, he's still going to write exactly the same book, but he'll have a little sort of introductory 3-page prologue, putting it in that security context. But even on something like that, academic publishing, actually even that becomes a question of the security of the state. The aggressive defensiveness. This is something I find fascinating. Obviously, there's going to have to be some kind of general audit by the General Staff as and when the war in Ukraine ends, as to what the lessons learned have been and how that should shape the future of the Russian military. But it is quite interesting that at the moment they're still aiming for the kind of high tempo, rapid, all arms sort of conflict that they're not fighting in Ukraine. I mean, in Ukraine, this is a war which is basically being fought by 10 guys on foot assaulting a tree line, rather than that. But at the moment, there is still this view that the wars that Russia needs to fight have to be aggressive and rapidly moving into someone else's territory. And most importantly, preemptive disruption as a priority. It might sound ridiculous to us to think of the Russians being afraid of NATO. And truth to tell, I don't think most, shall we say, professional security-oriented Russians, whether we're talking about military officers or think tankers or the like, really believe NATO is a threat. But the political leadership does. And to a degree, therefore, everyone has to respond in those terms. And if you think NATO is a threat, you have to work out how to disrupt it. And that disruption happens on all sorts of levels. It operates on, for example, how do you look at specific strengths that you think the West has, or the West definitely has, and how do you disrupt it? So, for example, information operations, to divide it politically, electronic warfare, an area which the Russians are actually very good at, to degrade the technological edge that the West has. A2AD this is not a Russian concept. It really annoys me when we have things about, oh, the Russian A2AD bastion of Kaliningrad or whatever. Actually, it's something that the Russians think that the West has. But again, how do you sort of break these sort of area denial bastions? And increasingly, therefore, they have turned to what we call hybrid war. I personally prefer the term political war, but there you go. That's me. I may come to that later. Because this is the war that they think they're already in, this is the war they think they have been in for pretty much 15 years. I mean, I'm amazed the degree to which you can speak to Russians, serious, thoughtful Russians, who are within the kind of think tank and sort of government sector, who will honestly say that, well, we're just catching up. We're just catching up with the Western capacity to do so. They're clearly wrong, but it's genuinely believed. And it provides this spectrum, this prism through which they look at all sorts of other developments. For example, the European Union deal with Ukraine that was going to be signed in 2013. At first, Moscow was actually quite relaxed about it, until it realized, frankly, accidentally, that this treaty would stop Ukraine from joining the Eurasian Economic Union, which was kind of Putin's economic structure that he wanted to sort of bring about across post-Soviet space, which clearly would be to Moscow's advantage. Now, it's not actually that the EU had wanted to exclude that. It's just that, well, this is a treaty that's largely drawn up by trade lawyers. But the point is, once they saw that, Moscow interpreted that as actually that this whole thing is an act of hybridnaya vojna. This whole treaty is actually intended precisely to steal Ukraine from Russia's sphere of influence and bring it into the West with the outcome that we know. And obviously the 2014 Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine was seen as that, seen as a Western-backed coup to topple the legitimate government. So they have to face this constant challenge of, what do you do about it? How do you respond? And in this case, often what you're actually having to make decisions about is not just, do you shoot or do you find other ways of fighting, but also a tension between how the military and how the civilian authorities think about hybrid war. Now, the military approach is straightforward. Again, I'm not going to sort of run through this. Chekhinov and Bogdanov, probably the most thoughtful and I would suggest authoritative military thinkers in recent years in Russia. Very much who see political operations, hybrid war operations, as ways of preparing the battlefield. They're how you ensure that by the time you send troops in, well, ideally that you've already won the war, but at the very least that you have improved their chances of success. And very much the operation in Crimea is regarded as a sort of case in point. That by already building up local auxiliaries and allies, encouraging political movements to support you, placing your agents, or at least kind of subverting certain Ukrainian leaders and officers, by the time those little green men deployed from their bases, it would have been very difficult, frankly, for Ukraine to do anything about it. Again, the full quote is fairly lengthy. But it's that. It's basically that this is genuinely hybrid in the sense of non-political means as a prelude to military means. Sorry, political means as a prelude to military means. That's all very well, but we have to remember the degree to which the military are not in charge of policy. Even stronger than in the West, I would suggest, there is a degree to which a political leadership that feels very jealous of its power keeps the generals in line and expects them to basically do what they're told. So although you do have this notion, it's not the dominant notion within the Russian political leadership. Instead, I really would want to bring the power of the Security Council Secretariat to the fore. The Security Council is the body that brings together all of the key figures within the Russian leadership who are even loosely connected with security. So it's not just heads of security agencies and the chief of the general staff and so forth. It's also the prime minister. It's other key ministers and indeed people like Moscow Mayor Sobyanin. However, the Security Council is not a decision-making body. It is essentially advisory, or it's a place where key decisions are promulgated and specific interagency disputes are resolved. So it's not a powerful body, it's just a body on which a lot of powerful people sit. But the Secretariat, the civil service body that supports the Security Council, is, in my opinion, massively important and indeed massively under-considered by the West. This is the body that doesn't just simply make sure that the agendas for the Security Council meetings are distributed on time. This is a body which has increasingly become the central apparatus through which anything security-related that is going to hit the president's desk runs. So in other words, these are the people who get to paint a picture of the world to the president. And that matters. I mean, I don't know if you know the slightly venerable British sitcom Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, in which a sort of hapless minister who then becomes Prime Minister is essentially manipulated by his suave civil servant. It's not quite that, but there is an element of that. If you get to control access to the president on security matters, not totally, but to a large extent, you have power. And the Security Council Secretariat, which for a long time was run by its secretary, the arch-hawk, Nikolai Patrushev, who I have described and still hold to as the scariest man in Russia, someone who genuinely believes a lot of barking mad conspiracy theories about how the West wants to and is trying to break Russia apart and everything else. And he knows that because a Russian psychic read former American Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's dreams, and from that devised that there was this grand project. Make of that what you will. It's the Security Council Secretariat in many ways that I think has really sort of shaped Russian policy on this. And they realize that there's no particular scope for success against NATO. So their approach is not that political operations are shaping operations to prepare the battlefield. Their approach is that political operations essentially intended to divide, distract, and dismay the West are actually the war in itself. They're not a prelude, they are the operations. Of course, we have one key problem here. These two types of notions of hybrid war look exactly the same, right up to the point where if and when the little green men appear. So, you could be facing a Russian campaign of subversion and you don't know if it's just simply the prelude to military operations or the full essence of the war itself, which is something that really does cause us challenges. So what does this mean for us? Well, first of all, we face a variety of constraints, but so too do the Russians. There clearly is a sense that Article 5 matters. I find this really interesting. We still agonize. We still agonize whether, in fact, if anything short of a massive challenge arose, would Article 5 really work? I mean, the classic way it's framed is, would Spain fight for Narva? The interesting thing is actually how little discussion there is in the Russian professional press and narratives about this. Because again, think of how Putin sees the world. As far as Putin is concerned, NATO is America's Warsaw Pact. He doesn't think Spain would have a choice whether it fights for Narva. The Russians actually, or certainly Putin, does indeed seem to think that Article 5 is serious and something that can't be sort of flouted. Hence the pressures on trying to actually divide and sort of the West. Secondly, just the sheer sort of algorithms of power. Read the Russian press and you'll see a lot. Again, I'm not talking about just the general newspapers. I'm talking about the professional press. A very key awareness of Russian weaknesses compared with the West's. It's not framed as such, No one's going to write an article, why our army is rubbish, or anything like that. But nonetheless, reading not too far between the lines, there is a clear awareness of Western strengths. And of course, in an age of continuing mutually assured destruction, the nuclear threat is one that, again, constrains actually how far the Russians ever feel they could go. So, well, they will avoid direct challenges to the West. Putin himself said only a lunatic and only in a dream can imagine that Russia would suddenly attack NATO. Well, yeah, but Putin has said many things. But, he has consistently said this. 2024, he was saying it's complete nonsense about this. And to be honest, I hesitate to say in front of this audience that Putin's right, but nonetheless, there is some truth in that. Instead, it's all about dividing, distracting, dismaying. Dividing the West so that we cannot form any kind of coherent, unified response to what Russia is doing. Remember, whatever Russia's weakness is, Russia is still stronger than most NATO countries individually. Our strength is precisely our unity. Secondly, to distract us. How better to ensure that we're not going to do anything about, say, Ukraine, by pointing us in other directions. Hey, look what's going on in the Middle East. Hey, look what's going on in Africa. I'll talk, for example, in the final lecture about things that sort of Wagner, its role, but amongst its other roles was a grand distractor to ensure, particularly the French, who got very, very aggravated by what Wagner was doing in Francophone Africa, that ensured we'll be looking at other theatres. Syria was another sort of wonderful case in point. And dismaying us, trying to shake our will and capacity to stand up to Russia. Why does Putin keep mentioning his nuclear arsenal? Is it because there is any genuine threat of nuclear war? I would suggest not really. But what he does know is that any time he does that, it's front page news in the West. And there are certain political constituencies that will say, oh my God, things run the risk of spiraling out of control. We need to make some kind of deal with Russia before we have a thermonuclear Armageddon. So, in other words, shaking the will to resist. In this respect, actually, the Russians have been quite damaged by Trump's arrival because, the Russians always have had the benefit of being able to look more manic, more insane than the West. That's not so easy these days. So, the actual sort of outcome is that the Russians are essentially opportunist. There is no grand strategy. There cannot be. Instead, there is a desperate attempt to push against a whole variety of perceived opportunities, many of which will not actually work. They'll try this particular political narrative. They'll try this cyber attack. And often they will not work. We tend to focus on the ones that do work, but we have to acknowledge just how often they fail. But they will keep on trying things. And when something works, then they surge more resources in to try and to address it. They will essentially acknowledge that there is no grand strategy by unleashing a whole variety of different institutions. I call this the adhocracy at the heart of Putin's state. That actually your role is not really what your official job title might be. It's instead, how can you be useful to Putin? How can you gain Putin's favor? So we've had the spectacle of, for example, corporations not just raising military units for the war in Ukraine, but also trying their own little hybrid war operations and activities and political activities in the West. Is that actually what corporations ought to be doing? No, but that doesn't matter. In this system, everyone is trying to demonstrate their utility and their loyalty to Putin. So we will often face a whole variety of different challenges from a whole variety of different institutions, ranging from oligarchs and corporate actors, through the church, through different other government agencies. And it's not because there is some grand strategy behind it. It's because there's a whole bunch of different agencies trying to say, so boss, look what we've done for you. Now, please reward us. And yeah, as I say, much of this will fail, but that's okay. You launched loads of operations expecting many of them to fail and fail quickly. That's fine, because as long as some of them work, then you keep up the barrage of activities and you capitalize on those that do work. So, in conclusion, striking continuity of strategic culture through the years, through the centuries, even while the actual regimes look very, very different. And the key leitmotif is this extreme sense of vulnerability, which leads itself to preemptive aggression. Because this is a regime which is very much politically dominated and has strong political sensitivities, they do see politics as another one of the, or indeed often the dominant, battle space in which to fight. So, aggression doesn't have to be kinetic. As far as they're concerned, they don't really care about the means, they care about the effects. And if you can get the right effect through subversion and corruption, rather than conquest, great. You don't care what the means is along the outcome. And sometimes they're very good at what they do. Sometimes we honestly have to remember they're very, very bad. Not least because they often don't really understand democracies and how democracies work. But we must remember the Putin regime is not going to last forever. I keep crossing my fingers. And when that happens, the strategic culture is not going to suddenly change. But the threat perception may well. Remember, it's not just about the strategic culture doesn't tell you who is the threat. The strategic culture tells you what you do about threats. And it may well be that for the next generation, they will look perhaps to China, or they'll be looking to the potential for domestic unrest or whatever as the crucial threat they have to address. So yes, on one level, Russia doesn't change. On another level, it absolutely does.